Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you today. Our presentation covers the National Parcel Carrier's 2019 general rate increases. And this year, we have some historically unusual behavior to discuss. As you may recall from our previous sessions, I spent 16 years with UPS and served my last 8 years in the UPS pricing department. Since then, I have spent over a decade in the industry assisting shippers in lowering their parcel costs. We are seeing something this year I've never seen before in relation to the GRI. Today, we will discuss the usual and the unusual elements of the 2019 GRI. Once we've reached the end of the presentation, there'll be time for a few questions. If you have anything you would like to ask, please type your questions when we have reached the end. I will answer as many as time permits. If we can't get to yours, we will answer all remaining questions via email, as well as provide a link to a recording of this session. And now the 2019 Carrier GRI. The things we're going to cover today are both the 2019 FedEx general rate increase announcements and the recently made UPS 2019 GRI announcements. We're going to identify the areas of greatest increase for 2019 and the shipper profiles of those most affected. And we're going to talk about some actions that shippers can take to help mitigate these cost increases for 2019. A little about LJM for those of you who may not be current LJM customers. LJM was founded in 1998 with over 1,100 current nationwide customers. We're a leader in contract negotiation and parcel invoice audit services. Our staff has negotiated over 40,000 carrier contracts from both the shippers and carrier perspective. And we have staff members that worked in both the UPS and DHL pricing department, giving us a lot of insight into what's currently going on in the market. A little about myself. I've been in the industry 26 years. I don't like to admit I've done anything for 26 years, but that is the amount of time I've spent in the industry, which again gives me a long track record of watching these types of announcements and seeing the patterns that both carriers have gone through year over year and quite frankly, decade over decade. And I built thousands of agreements when I was a UPS pricing manager, and I see many thousands more. I probably see 12 to 14 a day. So that really, again, gives us a great perspective into what's going on in the market, what's market appropriate, what isn't, and what are all the current trends are from all of the carriers. Now, let's get into some of the details of the 2019 general rate increase. So first, FedEx was the first to announce this year, and they announced their rate increase on November 5th. Now, this was later than the traditional window of September of October, which we had seen for years and frankly decades before. It was very traditional for the carriers to both announce in September and October. Traditionally, UPS would announce a ground increase, then FedEx would announce the air increase, and then they would simply match each other. But recently, there's been a little bit of variance in that, but still, a September to October announcement was traditional, giving carriers a few months to prepare. UPS actually announced their rate increase last night, December 5th, which lets you know what I was doing all evening last night. But this was highly unusual, and we heard from quite a few of our customers over the past few weeks wondering when UPS was going to announce because they've had very little time to prepare for the rates in the new year. And that's caused quite a bit of consternation because it hasn't allowed them to plan. It hasn't allowed them to set their new internet prices for 2019. And of course, there's still a significant number of catalog shippers out there, and they need to plan their shipping so that they can print and distribute their catalogs. And they've had a really hard time doing that with the shorter time window. So this has been highly unusual behavior from both carriers, but particularly with UPS. Instead of announcing in September or October, actually waiting until early December to announce their rate increase. So let's talk about FedEx first. So again, their rate increase is going to go into effect January 7th of next year. So all shipments made January 7th or later will be subject to the 2019 rates. Now, I want to for the past few years. Really, it started in 2015 and has been increasing since then. This is obviously a screenshot from the FedEx website. You'll see just in September, they've had one, two, three, four different rate increases. And this is very common for the carriers now. Now, for decades, there would be one rate increase every year, the GRI, which would take effect the first week of January. And then shippers could move forward with stability and confidence, knowing it would be another year before there was any change to the rates. So any adjustments or changes or predictions made at that point would be set for a year. Well, that stability is gone now. Throughout the year, both UPS and FedEx have been making incremental rate increases. None of them as large as the GRI, of course, but very targeted ones. Accessorials going up, fuel surcharges changing, new accessorials being introduced, new calculations for how accessorials are applying, changing. So what we're seeing is a much more dynamic pricing environment where instead of a once a year predictable one-time rate increase, that's still happening, but then throughout the year, there might be a half a dozen to a dozen new rate increases throughout the year. So that creates an environment where you constantly need to monitor what the carriers are doing with their rates and react accordingly. Because if you don't change anything with regards to how you recoup shipping charges from your customers, or what you're charging on your website, or what you're charging in a catalog, by the end of the year, your expected recovery and your expected margins could significantly be eroded by the time the end of the year arrives. So let's go through a few of the particulars of the FedEx rate increase. First, as we talked about, it will go into effect on January 7th. Increases on their rates, so their base rates, your zone weight-based rates, the rate chart, so to speak, that everyone's used to looking at, is going to go up 4.9%, which, as most of you probably know, is identical to last year's. It is important to note, however, that this 4.9%, which is the stated rate increase, so this is what FedEx announced in their press release, that it would be a 4.9% rate increase. This does not apply to any accessorial discount increases. So this is purely the base rate increase, right? So there are, and we'll spend some more time talking about accessorial discount or accessorial increases as we go. So the accessorial rates can significantly increase the net effect of the GRI well beyond the 4.9%. And even the base rate increase itself of 4.9%, it's nonlinear. So this causes a high degree of variance between the actual increase one shipper to the next. And we're going to go into some detail on that. But there's going to be a big difference between ground shippers and air shippers, high weight shippers and low weight shippers, short zone shippers and long zone shippers. So there can be several percentage points difference in the net effect of the rate increase depending on your shipping profile. So we need to keep that in mind. The trap a lot of folks fall into, and it's really dangerous, is they'll see the announcement of 4.9%. And what they'll do is they'll take their 2018 spend, add 5% to it, and assume that's what they'll spend in 2019. Well, that's only a fraction of the picture. So that calculation will almost always be misleading and be too low. Your characteristics can dramatically affect that. And again, we're going to talk about that in a little more detail. Okay, FedEx increases by weight. So this chart shows the cell by cell increases in the different services by weight. So you'll see that shippers in the heavier weight categories, 31 to 50, 51 to 70, 71 to 150, across all services are going to see higher increases than those that generally ship lower weight packages. So by percentage, and certainly these packages are already more expensive than these packages, so in real dollars, the impact is going to be significant. But percentage-wise, as you can see, The heavier the weight, in general here, the higher percentage rate increase there is. And one thing to keep in mind that's very important about this, the weight here, this is your build weight. So this is the weight after dimensional weight has been applied. So if you ship so if we talk about priority overnight, if you have a package that's actually 45 pounds, that's what it weighs, 45 pounds, but it's being dim weighted up to 60 pounds, then you're looking at that 51 to 60 pound increase here. So this is based on build weight, and that's how you need to evaluate your packages, on build weight. But you can see from this example, the higher weight bands are where the highest percentage of increase is being incurred. And this is just another way to demonstrate that, maybe a little easier to remember. Again, the 1 to 5 pound is going up 38%, whereas the 31 to 50 is going up 5.7, and then you can see the variance there. So emphasis on 21 pounds and greater. This is the ground increase. Emphasis on 21 pounds and greater. Okay, now let's take a look at it by zone. So this is the shipping zones, the ground delivery prices, and then the weight breaks over here. For lightweight shipments, the zone 2 1 pound rate, which of course everyone is probably familiar with the fact that this is a very important benchmark rate, that zone 2 1 pound rate, because that's typically the shipment minimum charge for FedEx. And that's going from $7.58 to $7.85, which historically speaking is not a large percentage increase. It's going up 3.6%. The last few years, we've seen a higher increase in that particular cell. But this is important because for a lot of shippers, especially if you're either a lightweight shipper or you have an extremely aggressive ground discount, a very large portion of your packages are going to hit this minimum. So this particular rate will have an outsized impact on your total rate picture than perhaps some other rates would. The 21 to 50 pounds, zones 2 through 5. So the short to mid zones, zones 2 through 5, 21 to 50 pounds, that's where we're seeing the greatest increase for FedEx ground services. So again, zones 2 through 5, 21 to 50 pounds. In here is where we're seeing the greatest increase. So if that's where your packages fall, we may need to really look at some ways to mitigate that increase. And I found this really interesting. I know this might be a little busy, but you can see, for example, again, we're looking at FedEx ground and home delivery. For zone 2, those lightweight packages only went up 2.3%. But for zone 7, they went up 4.4%. So I think the main point this graph gets across is, again, the nonlinear nature of these increases. Based on zone and weight and service, all those three factors together can really change how much your rate increase is, right? If you ship lightweight zone 3, you actually could conceivably be under, as far as your base rate increase, under the stated increase. Whereas in a lot of these areas, you may be significantly over the stated increase. So it's very important to have a good understanding of your actual package characteristics and where you'll fall into the different categories in this particular GRI. Okay, increases by service. So one thing that really jumped out at me when I was looking at it is the more aggressive increase in the express services versus the ground services. So if we look at ground across the rate strata, it varies from 3.8% up to 5.7%. But when we look at the air services, particularly the higher weights, we see increases of all the way up to 9%. And that's pretty dramatic. So ground overall is 4.9, priority overall is about 6%, and 2 days increase is 6.5%. And I find this to be pretty significant because one of the patterns we've seen in recent years is a lot of shippers who are trying to compete with the 2-day delivery model that was really pioneered by Amazon. They like to combine both ground and 2-day air service in order to make that 2-day delivery across the country. So they'll use ground in their short zones, in their local deliveries, and then they'll upgrade to 2-day air in the long zones. Well, that 2-day air, those 2-day air packages are now going to increase at a pretty rapid rate, as we see here, more so than their ground rates. So that's going to, for those people that are making that shift, those shippers that are splitting between ground and 2-day, a lot of thought is going to have to go into understanding the impact of that and coming up with a strategy to help mitigate that and bring it in line. So, because FedEx announced their increase a little earlier, we had a lot of time to run a bunch of our current customers that are FedEx shippers to take their 2018 shipping volumes and run it through their new 2019 FedEx rates to see the impact. And the average increase was over 8.1%. Some of them were significantly higher, 12 or 13. Some of them were less, more like 6.5. But 8.1 was the average. And that's when you put in all the different weight breaks and then also some of the accessorials. So we talked earlier about not just applying that flat 5%. You should probably be applying a number somewhere more around 8%. But of course, your characteristics could cause that to go up or down. And so it's important to look at those specifically. Okay, so service level rate increases again. So next day and 2-day air AM in the long zones, zones 6 and 8, are the ones that really got hardest hit in this particular increase from FedEx. Now, regular 2 days is a slightly different story because their increases were more in the shorter zones. So whereas next day and 2-day air AM, zones 6 through 8, the longer zones took a larger increase. For regular 2-day, it was some of the shorter zones 3 and 4, that took a higher increase. So again, there's a lot of variance depending on where you're shipping. Now let's talk about surcharges or accessorial charges, because this is where we see more dramatic swings in the potential increases. So first, most of the most common accessorials increased, and some of them pretty significantly. So residential surcharges and delivery area surcharges, they saw increases between 5 and 6%. So those are pretty significant, and those hit a very high number of packages. Also, and this is a continuation of a pattern we've seen for a few years now, and we don't see it slowing down anytime soon, is significant increases in surcharges that target packages that are oversized, that are particularly large, or that require additional handling, things that are not conveyable. So a lot of times things that are in like 5-gallon buckets or tires with a label on them. The carriers are really making a statement that they just don't want those types of packages in their parcel network because of the variance and the cost increase that they incur. So additional handling and oversized fees go up 12.5%. In this rate increase. And that's on top of very significant increases last year and the year before. So you can see just the oversized fee has increased to $90, additional handling's up to $13.50. And this is a trend that we've seen for a while, and we think we'll see continuing. And then one I just wanted to point out here was print label fee went up 100%. It went up from 50 cents to $1. And this is one of those fees we see that a lot of shippers don't use, but the ones that do use it a lot. So it could be very significant for a particular subset of shippers. But accessorials are really important things to look at when evaluating the impact of the rate increase on you, because obviously if you're an oversized and additional handling type shipper, it's going to have an outsized impact on you over the norm. All right, now it's not all bad news. I don't want to make it sound all particularly negative. There were some accessorial charges that didn't increase, and some of them have remained flat for a few years now. The other thing that I really looked for that I was happy to see is FedEx did not increase their dimensional divisor. So, a few years ago it was 194, then it dropped to 166, then it dropped to 139. There hasn't so far been an adjustment to that. So that's good, because it was in a very negative pattern for shippers for a while. That seems to have stabilized. Now, one thing I do want to mention is all the information that we're providing here is based off of the FedEx and UPS that there's something new and exciting in the service guide that hasn't been discussed in the press release. So that's a caveat I do need to make, that some things that are stated here or were not mentioned. So for example, a lot of times if there's not an increase like with the dimension, they just won't address it at all. So we assume it stays the same, and typically it does, but there's always the possibility that there'll be a further adjustment in the service guide. And for our customers, we will make them know that once the service guides come out. Okay, so now let's talk about UPS. And again, UPS just announced last night their rate increase is going to go into effect December 26th of this year. Versus January 7th for FedEx. So just a few notes on it. So they announced yesterday, which again is the latest date ever for a UPS announcement. And I ended up having to change half this presentation because part of it was going to be talk about why UPS hadn't announced yet. But we did get it late last night, but this still is the latest they've ever announced. And it takes effect in just 20 days. Which is the shortest window shippers have ever had to prepare. So you know, typically with a September or October announcement, you have several months to get ready for it. Here they've announced and you have 20 days before the new rates go into effect. So that's not a lot of time to react. And of course, there's a lot of things that depend on these rates. So it's going to be a real challenge for a lot of shippers to make the adjustments they need to and the planning that they need to and the modeling that's necessary with such a short window. And then lastly, the point that I want to bring up is that UPS's rate increase will go into effect 12 days before FedEx's rate increase. So that's of significant note, the date difference between the two. Now, I want to put the rate increases in perspective because we hear quite a bit from customers. You know, their constant complaints about the carriers' rates going up every year, or at least it feels that it's going up significantly every year. So I wanted to shine a little perspective on it, and our staff did a real good job data mining to get some of this information and put it together. So over the past 5 years, again, we're just trying to put these in perspective here. The U.S. cost of living has gone up 8.2%, right? So general inflation has driven the COLA up 8.2%. UPS shipping rates have gone up 24.5% during that same period of time. And UPS profits have gone up 79.3%. So obviously, this is a very significant number and increase. And I always got to ask the question, how do these figures compare to yours? Because there are times when we talk to customers about renegotiating and they say, well, you know, I always feel like, you know, I don't want to put any pressure on my rep or anything like that. Well, these really let you know that, hey, there's plenty of room out there. UPS is making plenty of margin. You know, one thing that when I was a UPS pricing manager, we always discussed is, you know, when UPS raises its rates 5%, it's getting 5% more revenue, but it's not delivering a single additional package. So it's doing the same thing it did. So on December 24th, it's doing the same thing they're doing on December 26th. They're just getting 5% more money for it. Right. So that's one way you really got to look at these rate increases is it's pure margin improvement on their end, which is fine. I mean, they're a for-profit company and they deserve to make a profit, but it's also okay for you to ask for some relief for that. And we'll get into that a little bit more as we go. All right, so the UPS rate increase by weight. Let's dig into these details a little bit. And again, we haven't had quite as much time to digest the UPS announcement as we did with FedEx, but we were able to do a fair job last night and this morning. So again, you can see the difference cell by cell, just like with FedEx. And once again, the shippers in the higher weight zones or the higher weight strata are seeing a higher percentage increase than those in the lower weight strata. And really, the only exception to that is 3-day select. 3-day select for UPS has a higher increase in the lower weights than it does in the higher weights, but all other services, the bulk of the increase is falling into the higher weight stratus. By zone, you can see that the rate increases are fairly consistent over the zones. For ground services, but just a variance of 4.9 to 5.3. So there's not a lot of variance there. But next day and second day air services are seeing long zone increases that are a lot more than the shorter zone increases. And by service, if we look at the service level, it's really important to note that just like FedEx, the air services are seeing higher percentage increases than are the ground services. Ground's going up 4.9, next day air 6.5, second day air 6.6, and you'll see that these are only a few tenths of a percent off, if at all, from the FedEx increase. So once again, the increases are very, very similar between the carriers. And here, now we modeled a fair number of our customers, but again, we haven't had a whole lot of time, so we just did a sampling. So it was a smaller sampling than FedEx, and you'll see that once again it exceeds 8%. It's only a tenth of a percent difference from the ones we looked at for FedEx. So again, very similar increases between the two carriers. Now, you may be a customer that falls into a particular bucket where the variance would be greater, but overall, when you're looking at quote unquote averages, they're very similar. Now let's look at some UPS surcharges, because there is more variance in the surcharge increases than there were in the base rate increases. So residential and DAS for UPS are also going up quite a bit, 7.3 to 9.7%. And again, they're also targeting the larger packages, the non-conveyable packages, the non-corrugated packages, those types of things. Now, additional handling and large package fees increased up to 21%. So you'll see here between 18.8 and 21.1%. The over max fees really surprised us. They've increased 30%. So now an over max package with UPS will cost over $850. Now remember, this is just the surcharge. This includes none of the actual transportation charge. This is just the surcharge for giving them a package that exceeds what they declare as their maximum dimensions. So again, they are trying to drive those particular types of packages out of their network. Another thing I wanted to note is the third-party billing fee. That's actually gone up significantly as well, from 2.5 to 4.5%. This is also one of those fees that a lot of customers don't use, but the ones that use it a lot. So if you fall into that category, this is definitely something you're going to want to address before the rates go into effect as best you can. Now, this is just one example that I wanted to bring up with regards to a change UPS made. UPS has changed the fuel application in this GRI. And what that means is in 2018, these are the different accessorial charges that UPS applies fuel to. So the current ground fuel is 7.25%. So these services would get that 7.5% applied to it, these accessorial charges. But not all accessorials do. In 2019, they're adding these 4 accessorials to the fuel calculation. So that means these 4 accessorial charges will now get a 7.25% fuel added to it. So just to give you an example, that over max charge that we talked about of $850, that accessorial that did not used to have fuel applied, 2019 it will have fuel applied. So that's an additional $61.63 in fuel applied to the already increased surcharge, for a total of $911.63 in overmax and fuel charges. And again, we have not even applied the base transportation charge yet. This is simply the accessorial and the fuel. So if you're someone that has particularly large packages, If you're shipping whiteboards or carpets or something along those lines, this is really something that we need to look into and see if either contractually there's a way that we can mitigate some of this, or operationally maybe you need to find another way to get those packages to your customers. And this is just a brief comparison of, for ground services, 1 to 20 pounds, the difference in the rate. And I just want to show that there are some differences, but they are very close. So the Zone 2 1 pound package, which is, again, it's that key benchmark rate because that's what the minimum charge typically is, that they're identical now. UPS had a 1 cent advantage in 2018. In 2019, they'll be on par. And again, you can see there's slight variances too, 823 to 865, 852 to 865, but they're very close. Now, this information can be very helpful for shippers that do have the technological ability to rate shop. So if you have that ability in your shipping system and you have competitive rates with both UPS and FedEx, your system may be able to pull out the variances between the two carriers, in particular zone weight combinations, and make a good decision on how to send that package. And LJM has technology solutions that do that as well. We have a rate shopper tool that can help you with that if you currently don't have that technology yourself. But this gives you an idea of the places where there is a variance and the places where they match. So overall, one of the points that you got to take away, this is the first one. Year over year, the rates keep going up. One of my maxims is the only thing sure in life are death taxes and the UPS rate increase. And 4.9%, which is what the carriers state, that's where you start from. You start at that, and then you go up based on your air ground usage, based on your accessorial usage, and so forth. So 4.9% is the base, and it goes up from there. Please don't apply a 5% increase the next year and think that's where your budget will be, because you'll more than likely fall short. So a few takeaway messages here. First, a lot of the recent trends we're seeing in the last few years have continued through this. Number one, that the rate increases are nonlinear. And secondly, that they target certain types of packages. So the largest increases in surcharge and accessorial fees are focused on those unfavorable package characteristics, the additional handling packages, the large packages, the non-corrugated packages, those types of things. There's a very little correlation that exists between what the carriers say the increase is going to be and what your net increase is going to be, right? Because we see there's a lot of, if you're a long zone heavyweight shipper, your base rate increase may be 9% before we ever even look at accessorial charges. So again, there's very little correlation on a shipper by shipper basis to that 4.9%. And it never ceases to amaze me. You can see supposedly there's huge teams on both carriers deciding these rate increases, and yet every year they end up within a penny or two all over the place of each other. So they continue to move in virtual lockstep, right? As you saw from the charts, there's very few places where on the published rates where there's much difference between the two. There are a few, but they're very limited. So usually the only true area that differentiates the shippers with regards to cost is in the negotiated rates through their contracts. So, of course, this conversation always leads to, well, what do we do about it? Right? How do we mitigate these increases? How do I make sure my rates don't go up 8 or 9% next year, because we just can't survive that type of increase? So here's some must-dos to kind of defend yourself against these increases. Number one is you definitely want to stay up to date with what's going on. And as I mentioned earlier, checking in once a year to see what the GRI was, it's not going to be enough. So you really need to keep tabs on what's going on. UPS has a press room where these things are announced. FedEx has a newsroom. Of course, at our website at myljm.com, we have our own newsroom, and you can sign up for our newsletter, which will always keep you up to date with these types of things. And then, of course, we put on these presentations to keep you informed on what's happening in the market as well. There's also other periodicals, Inbound Logistics, Parcel Magazine, and so forth. A few other best practices you can do. One is you really want to ask your rep, say, look, I need to be communicated with anytime there's a rate increase, not just in the GRI, but any increase so that they can keep you informed on that. Okay, so that's number one. Number two is evaluate each announced change based on your own shipping characteristics, right? And you have to have a source, and I can't stress this enough, other than your carrier rep to tell you what the impact is going to be. We constantly get reports from our customers where the customer says, "Hey, my rep, I talked to my rep, and they said that it's only going to affect me 2%, or it's not going to affect me at all, or it's going to affect me very small." And once we dig into that, we find that that analysis is just not correct. And usually it'll be, well, they forgot to apply the minimum, or they didn't include this accessorial, or they didn't apply dimensional weight charges. So it's really, really important to make sure you have an independent source to validate any information with regards to the financial impact of any increase besides your carrier rep, because it really is important to note that those aren't always accurate. Okay, and then you always want to make sure you have a copy of your contract handy. And this is important because, for example, you may have had an accessorial charge when you originally negotiated your agreement that it wasn't very impactful, right? Maybe it was only $1 or so, and so you didn't worry about it. But now, after several years of rate increases, it's more significant. So you want to see if you've got a discount there, see if you have any protection against rate increases, if you have rate cap language, those types of things. So you always want to make sure every time you see an announcement, you can go back to your contract and see whether you have protection against that. You also want to make sure, this is a trend we've seen for 3 or 4 years now, where the carriers like to put in early termination penalties in their contract, where they basically say, if you try to renegotiate this contract in fewer than the term, which is typically 3 years, there's a penalty. And you want to never agree to that. Because of course the carriers can increase your rates whenever they feel like it. So you need to make sure you protect your ability to negotiate those. And then remember, you can negotiate as often as is necessary. You are signing a rate agreement with them, not a contract. So you can renegotiate those at any time, as long as you have a valid narrative that explains why that's important. And again, as I mentioned, they can raise their rates whenever they feel like it, and they do, as we see. So you are able to renegotiate to defend yourself against those increases whenever it's appropriate. And the carriers help each other with aggressive and almost identical rate increases year over year. Let us help you by defending yourself against those increases. So that's the end of the presentation. I know that we covered an awful lot of ground really, really quickly. So I want to get to some of your questions. And again, if there's any I don't get to, I'll make sure that we follow up. So the first question is, will we have access to this presentation after the meeting? The answer to that is yes. All of the webinars we do are on our website. They're housed on the website, and we can also we'll send out a link afterwards so that you can access that. I got another question kind of along the same lines. Okay. Another one is, why do you think UPS waited so long to announce their rate increase? That's a great question, and we had a lot of speculation on that. And then I talked to some of my sources. We had some other folks that talked to some of our sources there, and the consistent feedback we got was that UPS was spending a lot of time trying to calculate the effect of the new Teamsters agreement, the new collective bargaining agreement, and how much that was really going to cost them over time, and make sure that they built in a rate increase that would allow them to maintain their profitability even with the new collective bargaining agreement, which I think there's probably a fair amount of truth to that. But also, in addition, of course, it was so similar to FedEx's, and FedEx didn't go through that calculation, that I think there was a good amount of lockstep and copycat in there as well. All right. So I got a question about the increases over the past 5 years. So yeah, for base rate increases over the last 5 years for UPS, they've gone up 24.5%, as we talked about a little bit earlier, and that's in the presentation as well if you log into it afterwards. And that's been pretty consistent over time. I know when I was in the UPS pricing department, the average increase was about 2.5% to 3%. So we've seen some significant increases since that time. All right. Next question is, if you look at that many shipping contracts every day, are there overall patterns that you see over and over again for both big and small businesses? Top mistakes or overlooked opportunities? That's a terrific question. I would say the biggest mistake most shippers make when they're negotiating with the carriers is either not understanding what's negotiable, and focusing only on base rates and not on terms and conditions like accessorial charges, rate cap language in the future, those types of things. We see time and again where UPS and FedEx both will make base rate concessions because that's where the focus is from our shippers. However, they're making all that money and more back on accessorial charges, minimum charges, dimensional weight charges. So looking at each proposal or agreement from the carrier in totality is really, really critical. What's the typical cost to get our contract evaluated? We will do that service for potential customers for free. And there's a number of reasons for that. Number one is we want to help educate folks on where their contract sits in the market. Is it appropriate? Is it not? Number two, it obviously increases our own knowledge base. The more contracts we see, the more patterning we can do and so forth. So it's helpful for us. And number three, our typical fee for negotiating a contract is simply a percentage of savings. It's a gain share percentage of savings. And we have obviously limited resources with regards to folks with the experience necessary to do an effective job. So we want to quantify the opportunity for our own sake as well, to make sure it's something that's worth our time and our clients' time to pursue. Because if there's not a lot of opportunity there, we certainly don't want to waste our time or our customers' time in going through that exercise if there's not worthwhile to everybody. Another question about the presentation. Yeah, again, we'll send out a link so that you can go through the whole recording as well. The next question, how should we coordinate with our LJM representative on what our specific increase will be? So that's a great question. And that is a service that we provide to all of our existing customers. If you get in touch with your rep, with LJM, what we will do is provide, and we do this free of charge as well, a GRI analysis where again, we will take your 2018 shipping volumes. run it through your 2019 rates, which will include the rate increase, to let you know what the true net effect of that impact is. Is it more like 6 or 7%, or is it more like 11 or 12%? So we'll do that for you. Again, it's a service that we provide for all of our existing customers. We don't charge for that. And that way you can really understand how much your rates are going to go up. It'll help you in that predictability, help you understand how to react, and help you understand whether or not it makes sense for you to renegotiate at that particular time. All right, here's a question. Is there any new capacity from the small parcel coming on stream? So that's a good question too, and the answer is yes, but it's conditional. So UPS has a big plane order that's being delivered over time, and that's going to increase their international flight capacity a good bit. They've just added a few flights from China. Also, FedEx is spending heavily to expand their network in their Smart Post product, which is their partnership with USPS. And then, there's some other ones that are on a lower scale, but affect certain parts of the country dramatically. Like UPS just built a $400 million hub in Utah. And so that southwestern part of the United States, as that comes online, is going to see some really good increases in time in transit. There should also be some very aggressive rates in the geographic footprint of that facility, because they're going to want to get it up to economies of scale quickly. And so they're going to need to get some volume. And in order to do that, they're probably going to be very aggressive rate rise. So once that comes online, that's one of the things we definitely look for. And once that comes online, we contact our customers that might be in that impacted area and say, hey, now may be a really effective time to negotiate, considering the money that they just put into that asset. Yeah, I got a comment where Keith says everything's negotiable, and yes, that's everything is negotiable if you have the leverage. That is 100% true. Another one, assuming they're competitively priced, is the USPS really a viable replacement for UPS and FedEx? And the answer there, of course, is it depends. So as far as the post office goes, the reliability is not as good as UPS and FedEx. Their tracking data is also not as good. And of course, there's no guarantee. You cannot get back funds for late packages. So in that regard, if the price being equal, I would not choose a USPS solution versus a UPS or FedEx solution. But of course, the reason they have the business they do is the price is often not equal. And usually the post office is cheaper. And for a certain segment of shipments, a lot of times it does make sense, right? If it's less expensive, if it's non-critical, if the tracking's not critically important, then a lot of times it does make sense to use the post office. And we do recommend the post office for certain customers if it fits what they're looking to do. Okay, here's another really good one. How do you get around confidentiality clauses? Do you use a three-way NDA? So I was actually, and I'm glad I'm remote when I'm saying this, but I was actually in the UPS pricing department when the confidentiality clause was added to their agreements. And really, the way it's written and the intent are two different things. So the way it's the intent of that clause was to keep UPS customers from giving their UPS contract to FedEx, and FedEx customers from giving their contract to UPS. So that's really the intent, was to prevent you giving your agreement to the other carrier. It's written rather broadly. In fact, it's written so broadly that if you follow the language used, you couldn't have a lawyer look at your agreement unless they were on staff. You couldn't have an accountant look at your agreement unless they were on staff. So it's really, it's written vague enough that it's really non-enforceable, because there's no way you can conduct business if you can't have your lawyer or accountant look at your contract. So it's really never been an issue. Again, the only thing is you really can't share your UPS agreement with FedEx or vice versa, but sharing with a third party is okay. Do you directly negotiate or counsel the negotiation? That's a great question as well. So we do not directly negotiate with either UPS or FedEx. What we do is kind of serve as your back room. So if you were to engage with LJM to help with your negotiation, we would do a full analysis of your data, full analysis of your contract. We would come back to you with what we believe an industry appropriate rate for you would be, and then we'd walk you through the whole negotiation. We would write your emails to the carriers for you, but you would send them out. If you're going to meet with the carrier, we would have a pre-call where we would help you set the agenda. We'd counsel you on what to say. We'd counsel you on what not to say. And we'd let you know, well, when the carrier says this is how you want to respond. So we'll always be behind the scenes. You'll be the face of the negotiation, but we'll walk you through every step of the way. Every proposal that they make for you, we'll analyze it to see how close they've gotten to those industry targets that we've set forth, and then give you advice for the next. Then the last one that I see right now says, how does UPS and FedEx justify such hefty rate increases? So when you read their description of the rate increases, the way they describe it is they're investing heavily in new equipment. Their labor costs are going up. They're investing heavily in infrastructure, and that is definitely true. All that's true. However, when you look at, again, the increase in their profitability over the years, they're clearly collecting a lot more in new revenue than they're spending in infrastructure and equipment improvements. So that's how they justify it. In my opinion, it doesn't quite add up. They spend billions a year in those improvements, which is good. They're constantly improving their networks, but obviously of the increase, only a portion of that's going to those things. What is your advice for a shipper negotiating with a reduced spend? That is a really tricky situation, and we do get into that occasionally. And a lot of times, what that will necessitate, not always, but a lot of times, the best result is if you switch carriers, honestly, because the incumbent carrier views you as reduced spend, but you're all new business to the other carrier, right? If you switch carriers, you're all new business to them. So a lot of times that gets us the best result. But there are if that's not possible due to technology constraints or customer preference, we do negotiations. We see it all the time where a division will be spun off, or there might be a private equity firm that holds 10 or 12 firms in it, and one of them is sold and is going out on its own now. And that's tricky because a lot of what you're negotiating is really cost increase mitigation versus true cost improvement. Whereas if you just maintain the rates that you had prior as part of the larger organization, or as far as a larger shipper, that would be a win. So that's definitely tricky, but it's certainly not impossible. Okay, last one I see here is, as trends are moving to discourage large shipments or unfavorable dimensions, what patterns do you foresee in the future for shipping and consequently shipping costs? So it really is it's a very, very clear message that they are trying to drive these packages out of their network. So what shippers, there's a couple strategies that different shippers have employed to try to avoid these costs. One is right sizing their packages. So reducing package size through more efficient packaging methods has been effective for some folks where that's possible. There's a lot of shippers that might be over the threshold on some of these packages by an inch or two, and their packages include a lot of dunnage. And if we can reduce the dunnage, we can reduce the package size and therefore avoid these fees. So that's one. Two is to find another mode, right? If it needs to go, instead of through the parcel network, send it through an LTL network. That's another possibility. And then three, of course, is just getting a concession in the contract. So we've negotiated contracts where we've added a tolerance where basically UPS will forgive an inch or two on a package, which allows something that was close to actually fall under that threshold, or just negotiate a more aggressive discount on those fees to keep it in line with what it was historically and not have such an increase. So, well, that's all the questions that I see. Again, if there's any questions that come up later, you are more than welcome to submit them either through our website or to your rep. And then we can get the answer back to you, or we can schedule a conversation with myself or one of our other negotiators to go through it with you. But thank you very much for your time today. I really appreciate it. Another thing we're very open to, either through the website or contracting your rep, are those free analysis that we talked about, either a GRI analysis or a market appropriateness of your contract. And then lastly, if there is a topic that you'd like covered on a future webinar, please feel free to submit that as well, and we can help you out there. So thank you very much for attending. I hope everyone has a great holiday season, and please feel free to reach out for us if you need anything else.